They said the boy was born silent. They said his world was empty, a broken thing that could never be fixed. But in a mansion built on billion-dollar lies, the loudest sound wasn't a scream. It was the truth waiting to be heard, and the only person listening was the one woman they tried to erase. The sound of porcelain shattering against the library wall echoed like a gunshot. 6-year-old Leo recoiled, curling his small body into the deep corner of the velvet armchair. His tiny hands clutched a picture book to his chest, so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't make a sound. Not a whimper, not a cry. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror that had no voice. Vanessa Sterling loomed over him. Her face, usually plastered on society magazine covers with a perfect smile, was now twisted into an ugly snarl. "Give it to me," she shrieked, lunging for the book. "You think you are smart? You think pretending to read makes you normal. You are broken, Leo. You are useless." She yanked at the hardcover book. Leo didn't let go. He couldn't hear her insults, but he could feel the vibration of her rage, the hatred radiating off her like heat. That silence only seemed to fuel Vanessa's fury. "Stop fighting me," she screamed, her hand raised high, palm open, aiming for his small fingers to force him to release his grip. A hand caught Vanessa's wrist in mid-air. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a vice grip. Vanessa gasped, whipping her head around her diamond earrings, swinging violently. Simone Jackson stood there. Her gray Maid uniform was crisp, her expression stone cold. She had been washing the patio doors invisible until this second. Now she was an iron wall. "Let him go," Simone said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a dangerous kind of calm. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Vanessa tried to yank her arm back, but Simone didn't budge. "You get your dirty hands off me!" Vanessa spat her shock, turning into indignation. "Who do you think you are? You are the help. You clean the toilets. You do not touch me." Simone released her with a shove that sent Vanessa stumbling back in her designer heels. Simone immediately stepped between the woman and the child, a human shield. "I am the person telling you that if you raise your hand against this child one more time, God as my witness, you will regret it." Vanessa straightened her dress, her chest heaving. She laughed, a hollow, incredulous sound that bounced off the mahogany bookshelves. "You are threatening me. I am the future Mrs. Thorne. I own this house. I own you. And as soon as Julian gets home, you will be on the street begging for scraps." Simone didn't blink. She turned to Leo. He was trembling, staring at her back. He watched her posture, reading the safety in her presence even without hearing a word. Simone looked back at Vanessa, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "You can tell him whatever you want," Simone said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "But we both know who the real problem is in this room. And it isn't the boy." Simone knelt on the hardwood floor, her knees cracking slightly against the polished oak. She ignored the woman fuming above her. All her attention was focused on the small, trembling boy in front of her. Leo was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes darting between the two women like a trapped animal waiting for the cage to close. Simone reached out, her movement slow and deliberate, telegraphing safety. "Let me see," she whispered. Her voice was a balm, soft and warm. She gently took Leo's arm, the one Vanessa had been twisting just seconds before. The boy flinched, pulling back instinctively. It broke Simone's heart, but she held firm, her thumb brushing against his wrist in a silent apology. With a touch light as a feather, she rolled up the sleeve of his expensive cashmere sweater. What she saw made the air leave her lungs. It wasn't just the red mark from today. The skin was a canvas of pain. There were bruises in various stages of healing. Some were fresh and purple, blooming like dark violets. Others were yellowing, fading into the pale skin like old ghosts. There were pinch marks on the soft underside of his arm, hidden where no one would look, unless they were really looking. This was not the rough and tumble play of a 6-year-old boy. This was systematic. This was a map of cruelty drawn by a woman who knew exactly how to hide her work. Simone let the sleeve drop, smoothing the fabric down. She didn't look at Leo. She couldn't not without letting a tear fall, and she refused to cry in front of the monster standing behind her. She stood up, turning slowly to face Vanessa. Vanessa was busy fixing her appearance. She smoothed the front of her designer dress, checking her reflection in the glass of a cabinet, patting a stray hair back into place. The rage was gone from her face, replaced by a cold, haughty mask of indifference. "You are being dramatic," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with disdain. She didn't even look at Simone. She checked her diamond nails, bored. "He is a clumsy child. He falls. He bumps into things. It is not my fault he is defective." "Defective," Simone repeated. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Vanessa finally looked at her, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Do not look at me like that. You are just the help. You are a maid. You are here to wipe floors and dust shelves, not to lecture me on how to raise a child that isn't even yours. You do not know the burden of dealing with a broken thing like him. So stay in your lane, or I will have you thrown out before you can finish your shift." The threat hung in the air. It was the same threat Simone had heard 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. It was the weapon of the powerful against the powerless. But Vanessa had made a mistake. She thought she was speaking to a woman who only knew how to clean. She didn't know she was speaking to a woman who had spent years studying the darkest corners of human behavior before life took everything away from her. Simone took a step forward. She didn't shout. She didn't raise a hand. She simply let her posture shift. The slump of the servant vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and for a terrifying second, the maid was gone and the doctor was back. "Displaced aggression," Simone said. Her tone was clinical, precise, stripping Vanessa bare. "You do not hate the boy because he is broken. You hate him because he is the only thing in this house you cannot charm, manipulate, or control. His silence reflects your own insecurity back at you, and you cannot stand it. You hurt him not to teach him, but to feel powerful in a life where you are just an accessory to a checkbook. That is not parenting, Vanessa. That is a pathology, and it is usually found in people who are terrified of being exposed for exactly what they are." The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The arrogance drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. She stared at Simone as if the maid had suddenly started speaking in tongues. It wasn't just the insult. It was the vocabulary. It was the diagnosis. It was the way this woman in a gray uniform looked right through her designer clothes and saw the ugly small thing hiding underneath. For a heartbeat, Vanessa looked frightened. She looked at Simone, really looked at her, searching for the person she thought she had hired. But that person wasn't there. "Who are you?" Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sudden creeping doubt. Simone didn't answer. She just turned back to Leo, picked up the book from the floor, and placed it gently in his lap. But the war had been declared. And for the first time, Vanessa realized she wasn't fighting a servant. She was fighting an equal. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous foyer. A gust of cold rain followed Julian Thorne inside, clinging to his trench coat like a second skin. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped under the weight of $1 billion empire, and his eyes were dull, the color of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to coming home. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the marble floor with a heavy thud, the sound signaling the end of one battle and, unbeknownst to him, the beginning of another. Before the echo had even faded, the transformation happened. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Vanessa, who had been standing over Leo with a face twisted in cruelty just moments before, dissolved into a picture of frailty and concern. Her posture softened, her eyes widened, filling with practiced tears. She rushed across the hall, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the stone, and threw her arms around Julian's damp neck. "Oh, Julian," She breathed, her voice trembling with a perfect mix of relief and exhaustion. Thank God you are finally here. It has been such a difficult afternoon. I did not want to call you during your meetings, but I am at my wit's end. Julian peeled her arms away gently, his expression weary. What happened, Ness? Is it Leo again? Vanessa nodded, wiping a dry tear from her cheek. She gestured vaguely toward the library where Leo still sat on the floor clutching the book she had tried to rip from his hands. I tried to read to him, Julian. I just wanted to have a nice moment to bond with him like a mother would. But he went into one of his moods. He started screaming. He threw the book at me. He was thrashing around so violently I was terrified he would hurt himself. Or me. She held up her wrist where a faint red mark from her own bracelet pressed against her skin earlier. Look. He grabbed me when I tried to calm him down. I do not know how to handle him when he gets like this. It is like there is no one in there, Julian. Just anger and silence. Julian looked past her, his gaze landing on his son. Leo did not look angry. He looked small. He sat huddled on the rug, his knees pulled to his chest, staring at his father with an intensity that begged to be understood. But Julian did not see the plea. He only saw the mess. He saw the overturned chair. He saw the book on the floor. He saw his beautiful fiancée looking distressed. He walked over to the boy, his footsteps heavy. Leo looked up, his eyes searching his father's face for a sign of affection, a sign of rescue. Instead, Julian let out a long, ragged sigh. He ran a hand through his wet hair, shaking his head. Why do you make it so hard? Leo, Julian said, his voice devoid of anger, but filled with a crushing disappointment that was somehow worse. Vanessa tries so hard with you. Why can you not just be normal for one single day? Leo blinked, reading the body language of rejection he knew too well. He lowered his head, retreating back into his shell. Simone stood in the shadow of the hallway arch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The injustice of it burned in her throat like bile. She had seen the bruises. She had heard the insults. She knew that the red mark on Vanessa's wrist was from her own vanity, not the boy's aggression. She could not let this stand. She could not watch a father break his own son's heart based on a lie. She took a step forward, her mouth opening to speak the truth that would shatter the room. Mr. Thorne, she began, her voice firm. You need to know what really happened. Before she could take another step, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. It was Harrison, the head butler. He was a man of tradition, a man who valued order over truth. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path to Julian, his face an impassive mask. That will be all. Simone Harrison said, his voice low and sharp, leaving no room for argument. The master has had a long day and does not need to be disturbed by the housekeeping staff. Return to your duties immediately. Simone tried to push past him, her eyes locking on Julian's back, willing him to turn around, willing him to see the game being played right in front of him. But Julian did not turn. He put his arm around Vanessa, guiding her toward the stairs, leaving his son alone on the floor. Harrison squeezed Simone's shoulder, a silent warning. Do not make a scene, he hissed. You are replaceable. The boy is not your concern. Simone watched them walk away, the heavy silence of the house settling back over them like a shroud. She looked at Leo, who was now tracing the pattern on the rug with a trembling finger. She had been silenced, blocked by the hierarchy of this cold mansion. But as she looked at the defeated slump of the boy's shoulders, the fire in her chest didn't go out. It only burned hotter. They thought they had won. They thought she was just a maid who would go back to scrubbing floors. They were wrong. The dining room was a mausoleum of cold silence. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the long mahogany table where the family sat separated by yards of polished wood. Julian ate mechanically, his eyes glazed over, his mind clearly drifting back to stock prices and board meetings. He did not notice the small glass vial hidden in the palm of Vanessa's hand as she stood by the sideboard. She held the ladle over Leo's bowl. With a flick of her wrist, she tipped the vial. A concentrated drop of ghost pepper extract, a liquid fire used for industrial seasoning, vanished into the creamy mushroom bisque. She stirred it once, quickly burying the evidence. "Here you go, sweetie," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that made the air feel sticky. "I made this special just for you. Eat up." She placed the bowl in front of the 6-year-old. Leo looked at the soup. He looked at his father, who was busy checking a notification on his phone. Leo was hungry. He had not eaten since breakfast because Vanessa had thrown his lunch in the trash when Simone wasn't looking. He trusted the food because he had no other choice. He picked up his silver spoon, filled it to the brim, and swallowed. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The concentrate hit his throat like molten lead. It seared the delicate lining of his esophagus, burning with the intensity of a chemical weapon. Leo's eyes bulged. His mouth flew open in a silent scream, his vocal cords paralyzed by the shock of the heat. He clawed at his throat, his face turning a dark, alarming shade of crimson. Tears exploded from his eyes, streaming down his cheeks in rivers of panic. He gagged, his small body convulsing as his stomach violently rejected the poison. With a wet, retching sound, Leo vomited all over the table. The mess splattered across the expensive imported linen and sprayed onto the cuff of Julian's pristine white dress shirt. Julian slammed his fist onto the table. The silverware jumped and clattered. "Damn it, Leo!" Julian roared, leaping to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Can we not have one civilized meal? Just one?" Leo was gasping for air, clutching his chest, his mouth open as he tried to cool the inferno in his mouth. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading for water, for help, for mercy. But he could not speak. He could not say, "My throat is burning." He could only cry. Vanessa gasped, jumping back and pressing a napkin to her mouth in feigned horror. "Oh my God! Look at what he did!" She rushed to Julian's side, dabbing uselessly at the stain on his sleeve, her voice rising in a perfect performance of victimhood. "He did that on purpose, Julian. I saw him. He looked right at me before he did it. He knows I spent hours making that soup. He hates me. He hates that I am trying to be his mother." She turned to glare at the gasping boy. "Why are you so vicious, Leo? Why do you want to ruin everything for your father?" Julian looked down at his son. He didn't see a child in medical distress. He saw a defiant, broken boy who had just ruined the only hour of peace he had all day. The stress of the business, the pressure of the engagement, the silence of a son he didn't know how to love, it all boiled over into a blinding frustration. "Go to your room," Julian shouted, pointing a shaking finger toward the door. "Get out of my sight. Now!" Leo couldn't breathe. His throat felt like it was swelling shut. He looked at Vanessa. She was standing behind Julian's shoulder, her hand resting possessively on his arm. For a split second, the mask slipped. She smiled, a tiny, cruel curve of her lips that said, "I win." Leo slid off the chair, his legs shaking, and ran from the room, clutching his burning throat, the taste of fire and betrayal heavy in his mouth. The dining room was quiet now. The heavy silence of the aftermath hung over the spilled soup and the stained tablecloth. Simone moved mechanically, gathering the ruined linens, but her mind was racing. The smell rising from the table wasn't right. It was too sharp, too acidic. It didn't smell like cream and mushrooms. It smelled like danger. She paused, looking at the bowl Leo had abandoned. A small pool of the bisque remained at the bottom. Instinct took over. She dipped the tip of her pinky finger into the cold soup and touched it to her tongue. Fire. Instant, blinding fire. It wasn't just seasoning. It was a chemical burn. Her eyes watered immediately, and she grabbed a glass of water, gulping it down to douse the flames on her tongue. That poor boy. He hadn't been throwing a tantrum. He had been tortured in plain sight. She marched into the kitchen, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She went straight to the sleek stainless steel trash can. She dug through the coffee grounds and vegetable peelings until her fingers closed around something hard and cold, a small glass vial. The label was scraped, but she could still read the warning. Industrial strength capsaicin. She pulled it out, wiping it on her apron. She needed Julian to see this. She needed him to understand that his son wasn't broken, he was being broken. She set the vial on the center of the granite island right where Julian would see it when he came down for his evening scotch. A shadow fell across the counter. Vanessa stood in the doorway. She had changed into a silk robe, looking every inch the mistress of the house. Her eyes landed on the vial instantly. She didn't panic, she didn't scream, she moved with the speed of a viper. Before Simone could react, Vanessa swiped the vial off the counter and dropped it into the deep pocket of her robe. "You missed a spot on the floor," Vanessa said, her voice smooth and uninterested. Simone didn't back down this time. She stepped around the island, blocking Vanessa's path to the door. "I tasted the soup," Simone said. Her voice was steady, stripping away the pretense of servitude. "I know what you put in there. That wasn't food, that was cruelty." Vanessa laughed, a cold, tinkling sound. "You have a vivid imagination. It was just a little kick. The boy needs to toughen up. He is too soft, like his father." "You burned his throat," Simone said, stepping closer. "You are hurting him on purpose. You are trying to make him look unstable, so Julian will send him away." "I see you, Vanessa. I see exactly what you are doing." Vanessa's smile vanished. Her face hardened into a mask of pure malice. She leaned in, her perfume cloying and sweet. "And who are you? You are the maid. You are nobody. You tell him and I will tell him you poisoned the soup yourself to frame me. I will tell him you are unstable. Who do you think he will believe? The woman he is going to marry or the help?" She brushed past Simone, her shoulder checking the maid hard. But Simone didn't flinch. She turned, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "He might believe you today," Simone said. "But you cannot hide the truth forever. I am watching you now. Every move, every meal, every step. You made a mistake tonight, Vanessa. You let me see the weapon." Vanessa paused at the door, her hand on the frame. Her knuckles were white. She didn't look back, but Simone saw the tension in her spine. The fear. For the first time, the monster knew it was being hunted. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the Thorne estate. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the silent hallways, a silence that Simone had learned to distrust. She was passing Leo's bedroom door, a basket of fresh linens in her arms, when she heard it. It was a sickening sound, a sharp, brittle crunch like a beetle being crushed under a boot. Then another, and another, grinding, deliberate. Simone stopped. The door was cracked open just an inch. She pushed it wider, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Leo was not in the room, but Vanessa was. The woman stood by the window, bathed in the soft morning light, looking like a portrait of elegance in her silk dressing gown and towering stiletto heels. But her face was twisted in ugly concentration. On the hardwood floor beneath her, a small, intricate device lay scattered in pieces. It was Leo's hearing aid. The custom-molded earpiece, the delicate digital processor, the tiny wires that cost more than Simone's car. It was a $15,000 lifeline, and Vanessa was grinding her heel into it with the precision of an executioner. She lifted her foot and brought it down again. Crack! The plastic casing shattered. A tiny battery rolled across the floor. "He won't need this where he is going," Vanessa muttered to herself, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Broken boy. Broken toy. Reason abandoned Simone. In that moment, she was not a maid. She was not an employee. She was a healer witnessing a violation. That device was not just plastic and wire. It was a bridge. It was the only thing connecting a terrified little boy to a world that had already turned its back on him. And this woman was severing it for sport. Simone dropped the laundry basket. The thud was dull, but it was the starting gun. She sprinted across the room. Vanessa heard the movement too late. She turned, her eyes widening in shock, but Simone was already there. With a cry of pure protective rage, Simone lowered her shoulder and slammed into Vanessa. It was not a polite nudge. It was a tackle born of desperation. Vanessa shrieked as she lost her balance. Her arms flailed, grasping at the air, but she went down hard. She hit the floor with a heavy thud, her silk robe tangling around her legs. Simone did not look at her. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached for the scattered remains of the hearing aid. She scooped up the processor, checking the casing. It was crushed. The delicate circuitry was exposed, bent and useless. "You monster," Simone breathed, clutching the broken pieces to her chest. Vanessa scrambled backward, crab walking away from Simone until her back hit the wall. She touched her face, her fingers coming away with a smear of expensive foundation. Then her shock turned into something sharper, a weaponized realization. She looked at the door. She looked at the broken plastic in Simone's hands. And then she screamed. It was a high, piercing sound designed to summon an audience. "Help me!" Vanessa wailed, her voice pitching up into hysteria. "Julian, help! She is crazy. She is attacking me." Simone stayed on her knees, the ruined device in her hand. She knew what was coming. She heard the heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway. She knew she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. But as she looked at the destroyed instrument of hearing, she didn't regret it. Not for a second. She had stopped the boot, even if it cost her everything. The heavy footsteps in the hallway grew louder, thundering closer with every second. Julian was coming. Vanessa knew she had only a heartbeat to turn the situation around. She looked at Simone kneeling on the floor with the broken plastic in her hands, and a terrifying transformation washed over Vanessa's face. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She knew exactly what she had to do to win. With a sharp intake of breath, Vanessa raised her manicured hand to her own face. She didn't hesitate. She dragged her nails down her cheek hard enough to break the skin. 3 bright red lines appeared, instantly welling with blood. Simone watched in frozen horror, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Vanessa didn't stop there. She grabbed the neckline of her expensive silk robe and yanked. The fabric tore with a loud rip, exposing her shoulder. She messed up her hair, shaking it wild, and then she threw herself toward the nightstand, knocking over a crystal lamp. It crashed to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. Then came the scream. It wasn't the scream of a woman caught doing something wrong. It was the blood-curdling shriek of a woman fighting for her life. "Julian, help me!" she wailed, her voice pitching up into a terrified frenzy. "Please, God, stop! She is killing me!" The bedroom door flew open. It slammed against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Julian stood in the frame, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with panic. The scene before him was a nightmare constructed in seconds. He saw his fiancée cowering in the corner, clutching her torn robe, blood streaming down her face. He saw the shattered lamp. And then he saw Simone. Simone was still on her knees, paralyzed by the shock of Vanessa's performance. In her hands, she clutched the jagged remains of the hearing aid. To Julian, in the chaos of the moment, it didn't look like a medical device. It looked like a weapon. It looked like a sharp, twisted piece of hard plastic she had used to attack the woman he loved. The jagged wires glinted in the sunlight like shrapnel. Vanessa saw him and collapsed into sobbing hysterics. She pointed a trembling finger at Simone. "She went crazy, Julian. She just snapped. I caught her trying to steal Leo's things, and she attacked me. Look what she did to my face. She tried to gouge my eyes out. She has a weapon, Julian. She is going to kill me." Kill. Julian's shock turned into a blinding white-hot rage. He looked at the blood on Vanessa's cheek. He looked at the destruction in the room. Then he looked at Simone. The trust, the tentative connection they had started to build over the last few weeks evaporated instantly. It was incinerated by the sight of violence in his own home. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with a terrifying intensity. Simone opened her mouth. She wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to say, "Look at her hands, look at the shoes, look at what she really broke." But the words stuck in her throat. The scene was too perfect. The lie was too complete. She looked down at the sharp plastic in her hand and realized how guilty she looked. "Drop it!" Julian roared. His voice shook the walls. "Drop it now and get away from her before I do something I regret." Julian stared down at Simone with eyes that had turned into chips of black ice. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer force of his fury. He did not ask what happened. He did not look for context. He looked at the woman kneeling on his floor, holding the shattered remains of his son's hearing aid, and he made a judgment that would shatter everything. "Mr. Thorne, please listen to me," Simone stammered, her voice shaking as she tried to hold up the broken plastic. "She did this. She was crushing it. I was only trying to stop her." Silence. Julian barked. The word exploded from his chest, violent and absolute. He snatched the broken device from her hand and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a final, pathetic crack. "Do not dare lie to me. Do not dare open your mouth and blame her for your violence." He stepped closer, towering over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. Vanessa whimpered, burying her face into his coat, her shoulders shaking with a performance worthy of an award. Julian wrapped a protective arm around her, shielding the predator from the protector. "I gave you a job when you had nothing." Julian spat, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that was more terrifying than his shouting. "I let you into my home. I let you near my son. And this is how you repay me, by attacking the woman I love, by destroying the only thing that helps my son connect to the world. You are not just ungrateful. You are a savage." The insult landed like a physical blow. Simone flinched, her eyes filling with hot, angry tears. She stood up, refusing to cower on the floor any longer. "I am not the savage here," Simone said, her voice trembling but audible. "Look at her hands, Julian. Look at her shoes." "Enough!" Julian roared. He grabbed Simone by her arm, his grip bruising, and shoved her toward the door. "I do not want to hear another word from you. I do not want to see your face. You are fired." Simone stumbled but caught herself. "You are making a mistake," she pleaded, desperation clawing at her throat. "She is hurting him." "Get out!" Julian screamed, pointing a shaking finger toward the stairs. "Get your things and get out of my house before I call the police and have you thrown in a cell where you belong. You are a danger to this family. You are unstable. And if I ever see you near my son or my wife again, I will ruin you." Vanessa peeked out from Julian's embrace. Her eyes met Simone's for a fleeting second. There was no fear in them, only a cold, triumphant smirk that vanished as soon as Julian looked down at her. "Oh, Julian," Vanessa sobbed, clinging to his lapel. "Please just make her go. I do not feel safe." "I have got you," Julian whispered, stroking Vanessa's hair, his back turned to Simone. "She is leaving. Right now." Simone stood in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the man she had started to respect, the man she thought was just misguided. But in that moment she saw that his blindness wasn't just about his son. It was about everything. He had chosen the beautiful lie over the ugly truth. She straightened her uniform, her dignity the only thing she had left to wear. She didn't look back at the broken hearing aid. She didn't look back at the weeping liar. She turned and walked into the hallway, the sound of her own footsteps, the only thing louder than the breaking of her heart. Simone wiped her face with the back of her hand. She did not wipe away tears because there were none. The heat of the injustice had burned them all away, leaving behind something cold and hard like steel. She stood up slowly. Her knees did not shake. Her hands did not tremble. She smoothed the front of her gray uniform, a gesture of quiet defiance that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Julian was waiting for the plea. He was waiting for the begging, the excuses, the desperate attempts to keep a job she needed to survive. He was used to people cowering before his anger. He was used to being the most powerful force in any room. But Simone did not give him that satisfaction. She looked him dead in the eye. Her gaze was not submissive. It was level. It was the look of a doctor delivering a fatal diagnosis to a patient who refused to believe he was sick. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the silence of the room like a bell tolling. "You called me a savage. You called me unstable. But I am not the one destroying this family. You are." Julian stepped forward, his chest expanding to shout her down again, but something in her expression stopped him cold. It was pity. She was looking at a billionaire with pity. "You think you are protecting your son?" She continued, her voice steady and clinical. "But you are handing him over to the wolf. You stand there with your empire and your power thinking you see everything. But you are blind. You are blind, not because your eyes do not work. You are blind because you let a woman cover them with lies just because she is beautiful and tells you what you want to hear." Vanessa gasped from the corner, trying to reignite the drama, but Simone did not even glance at her. She kept her eyes locked on Julian, refusing to let him look away. "One day, you will wake up," she said, "and you will realize that the monster was not the maid who tried to fix a hearing aid. It was the man who stood by and let it be broken." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room. She did not run. She walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. She went down the hall to the small servant quarters. She opened her closet. She did not throw things, she folded them. Her spare uniform, her Bible, a photo of her mother. She packed with a terrifying calm. It was surgical, precise, efficient. It was the movement of a woman who knew exactly who she was and knew that she did not belong in a house built on cruelty. Julian had followed her to the doorway, expecting a breakdown. He expected her to crack under the pressure of losing her livelihood. But watching her pack was more unsettling than any scream. It was the behavior of someone who knew they were right. It was the behavior of someone who had nothing to hide. She zipped the bag. The sound was final. She slung it over her shoulder and walked past him without a glance, leaving a silence in her wake that felt heavier than any noise. Simone's hand hovered over the brass latch of the heavy front door. The wood was cold under her palm. Outside, the storm that had mirrored the chaos inside the house was beginning to settle into a steady gray drizzle. She should just leave. She should walk away and never look back at the fortress of lies Julian Thorne had built around himself. But the image of Leo's face, the way he had looked at her when she held the broken hearing aid, stopped her. She could not leave him defenseless. Not completely. She turned around slowly. Julian was standing at the foot of the grand staircase. His arms were crossed over his chest, his posture rigid. He looked like a king watching a peasant being exiled from his court. He was waiting for the door to click shut so he could go back to his comfortable blindness. Vanessa hovered behind him on the landing, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, watching Simone with the predatory gaze of a viper, ensuring its kill was truly dead. "Mr. Thorne," Simone said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that made the air in the foyer seem to vibrate. Julian's jaw tightened. "I told you to leave. I am done listening to your excuses." "This is not an excuse," Simone said. She took a step back into the room, not far enough to be a threat, but close enough to be heard without shouting. "And it is not for you. It is for the boy." She locked eyes with him, her expression stripping away the social distance between master and servant. "You need to know something. Your son is not deaf. Not completely." Julian let out a sharp, derisive laugh. It was an ugly sound. "Do not be ridiculous. We have seen the best specialists in the country. His auditory nerves are non-responsive. You are a maid, not a doctor. Stop trying to play hero. Specialists look at charts." Simone shot back, her voice cutting through his dismissal. "I look at the child. Last week I dropped a heavy stack of encyclopedias in the library. It made a low, dull thud. It vibrated the floorboards. Leo was facing the window. He did not see it fall, but he turned his head. He turned right toward the sound." Julian froze. His mouth opened to retort, to tell her she was lying, but the memory of Leo turning his head at odd moments flickered in his mind. He pushed it away instantly. "That means nothing." He felt the vibration. He heard the low frequency. Simone corrected him, her tone shifting into something clinical, something authoritative that confused Julian. "He responds to low-frequency sounds, Mr. Thorne. That means the nerve is alive. It means there is a pathway. But he cannot hear your voice. He cannot hear the birds. Do you know why?" She pointed a finger toward the ceiling, toward the room where the little boy was currently locked away in silence. Because something is stopping the sound from getting in. Someone is blocking his ears, literally. Julian stared at her. The accusation was so monstrous, so physical, that his brain refused to process it. "You are insane," he whispered. "You are accusing my fiancé of physically plugging my son's ears. You are sick." Vanessa let out a gasp from the stairs. "Julian, please, get her out of here. She is trying to poison you against me." Simone ignored her. She kept her gaze fixed on Julian, planting the seed that she knew would grow in the dark. "Check his ears, Julian, not with a casual glance. Look deep inside. If you are half the father you pretend to be, you will look." She didn't wait for his answer. She didn't wait for him to throw another insult. She turned to press the latch and walked out into the rain. The heavy door swung shut behind her with a final resonant boom. Inside the foyer, silence rushed back in to fill the space she had left. Julian stood rooted to the spot. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He wanted to chase after her and scream that she was a liar. He wanted to go upstairs and comfort Vanessa. But his feet wouldn't move. The words echoed in his skull, low frequency, blocking his ears. Literally. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the desperate rambling of a fired employee. But as he looked up the stairs toward the nursery, a cold knot formed in his stomach. Because for the first time in years, the certainty he had built his life upon felt like it was standing on sand. And the tide was coming in. The storm outside had settled into a sullen, rhythmic drumming against the glass, but inside Julian Thorne's chest, the tempest was just beginning. He sat in his leather armchair in the library, a tumbler of aged scotch sweating in his hand. He had not taken a sip. He could not swallow past the lump of doubt lodged in his throat. "Check his ears." The words echoed in the silence, bouncing off the walls of his expensive, empty life. Simone's voice haunted him. It was not the scream of a disgruntled employee. It was the clinical, cold precision of her tone. Low frequency, bone conduction, blocking. It sounded insane. It sounded like the ravings of a woman trying to scorch the earth on her way out. But the image of Leo turning his head toward the falling book. Julian remembered that. He had seen it weeks ago and dismissed it as a vibration. But what if? He stood up the chair, scraping softly on the rug. He had to know. If he did not check, the question would rot him from the inside out. He walked into the hallway. The house was a tomb. He moved past the master suite where Vanessa lay sleeping, her breathing soft and even. He felt a pang of guilt for doubting her, for letting a maid's poison seep into his relationship. But he kept walking. He pushed open the door to the nursery. The room was bathed in the blue glow of a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship. Leo lay tangled in his sheets, his mouth slightly open, deep in slumber. He looked so small, so fragile. Julian crept closer, his socks sliding silently on the carpet. He stood over the bed watching the slow rise and fall of his son's chest. "Leo," he whispered. No reaction. Of course not. He was deaf. Everyone knew he was deaf. The doctors had shown him the charts, the flat lines, the dead nerves. Julian reached out to the nightstand and picked up a heavy die-cast metal toy car. It weighed a good pound. He held it out at shoulder height directly over the hardwood floor, just a few feet behind Leo's head. He took a breath. He let it go. The sound was sharp and jarring, loud enough to wake a sleeping dog 3 rooms away. Julian flinched instinctively. He waited. He watched Leo's eyelids. He watched his hands. He waited for the startle reflex, the jerk of a limb, the sudden waking cry. Nothing. Leo did not stir. He did not shift. His breathing did not even change rhythm. He lay there like a stone, completely and utterly oblivious to the noise that was still ringing in Julian's own ears. Julian stared at the boy, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He clapped his hands together, a violent cracking sound right next to Leo's ear. Still nothing. The hope that had flared in Julian's chest for one brief, agonizing hour flickered and died, leaving behind a cold, hard ash. He felt stupid. He felt manipulated. He felt a surge of hatred for Simone so potent it made his hands shake. She had played him. She had used his deepest, most desperate wish that his son was not broken against him. She had lied to hurt him, to plant a seed of chaos in his home, as revenge for being fired. "You are gone," he whispered to the empty air, his voice thick with bitterness, "and you are never coming back." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the metal car on the floor. He did not know that Leo's sleep was not natural. He did not know about the crushed sedatives dissolved in the warm milk Vanessa had insisted on giving him hours earlier. He only knew that he had tested the truth and the truth had failed him. He went back to his study and poured the scotch down the sink. He was done with fantasies. The bus ride to the south side of the city took an hour and a half. By the time Simone stepped off the curb and onto the cracked pavement of her neighborhood, the rain had turned into a freezing mist. The streetlights here flickered, buzzing with the sound of neglect. She walked past the boarded-up windows of a grocery store and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 4B. The door stuck in the frame, requiring a hard shove with her shoulder to open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The heating had been cut off 2 days ago. It was a single room, cramped and cluttered with the debris of a life interrupted. Books were stacked in towers against the peeling wallpaper. Medical journals, anatomy textbooks, research papers on cochlear implants and auditory nerve regeneration. Simone dropped her bag on the floor and peeled off the gray uniform. She hated that dress. It was a costume, a disguise she had worn to survive. She threw it into the corner and pulled on a thick wool sweater. She walked to the small, scratched mirror hanging over the sink and looked at herself. The fatigue was etched deep into her skin, but the fire in her eyes hadn't gone out. It had only been banked, waiting for oxygen. She knelt beside her narrow bed and pulled out a heavy plastic bin. She dragged it across the linoleum, the scraping sound loud in the quiet room. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she popped the lid. Inside lay the remnants of her former life. A framed diploma with the glass cracked down the middle. Dr. Simone Jackson, Doctor of Audiology, top of her class at Johns Hopkins. Beside it lay the letter from the medical board, the revocation of her license. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She had reported a senior surgeon for using substandard implants on children in low-income wards. She thought the truth would protect her. Instead, the hospital buried the evidence, the surgeon sued for defamation, and the board stripped her of her title. She had lost her career because she refused to let children be used for profit. And now, history was repeating itself. Another child was being sacrificed. Another lie was being told. Simone reached past the diploma and pulled out a worn black leather bag. It was her old field kit. She set it on the wobbly kitchen table and unzipped it. The tools inside gleamed under the harsh overhead light. A high-grade otoscope, a tympanometer for measuring middle ear pressure, and there nestled in velvet a set of medical tuning forks. She picked up the 512 Hertz fork. It was heavy, cold, and precise. She struck it against her knee and held it to her own ear. The hum was pure and clear. This simple piece of metal was the key. It was the lie detector that would expose Vanessa and save Leo. She wasn't just a fired maid in a cold apartment anymore. She was Dr. Jackson. She took a map of the city from the wall and spread it out on the table next to the medical kit. She circled the Thorne estate. She circled the hospital where she used to have privileges. She circled the private clinic Vanessa took Leo to. Julian Thorne thought he had solved his problem by throwing her out. He thought he had silenced the help. He didn't realize he had just unleashed the expert. Simone packed the tuning fork into her coat pocket. She wouldn't sleep tonight. She had a case to build, and this time she wasn't going to let the bad guys win. The library was dim-lit only by the glow of the dying fire. Vanessa stood by the window, her reflection ghosting against the dark glass. She pressed her phone to her ear, her voice low and sharp. "It has to be done this week," she snapped. "I do not care about the paperwork protocols. Grease the wheels, Arthur. That is what I pay you for." She paused, listening to the lawyer on the other end. Her eyes narrowed. The trust fund activates the moment he is declared incapacitated and placed in permanent care, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a blade sliding out of a sheath. That money is the only reason I have put up with this charade for 2 years. I want him gone. I want him in that facility by Friday. Do you understand me? She hung up the phone without waiting for an answer and slipped it into her pocket just as the heavy oak doors creaked open. Julian walked in. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His tie was loose, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. He walked to the liquor cabinet and poured a drink, his hand shaking slightly. Vanessa watched him, masking her triumph with a look of practiced concern. She walked over and placed a hand on his back. "You cannot keep doing this to yourself, Julian," she cooed. "It breaks my heart to see you like this. That woman. She twisted your head. She gave you false hope just to hurt us." Julian stared into his glass. "I wanted to believe her, Ness. For a second I really thought." He stopped, unable to finish. Vanessa moved around to face him, taking his free hand in hers. Her touch was soft, but her grip was firm. "I know," she said soothingly, "but we have to face reality. Leo is not getting better. He is getting violent. He is unhappy here. We are not equipped to give him the help he needs." She reached onto the desk and picked up a glossy brochure she had left there earlier. It showed a pristine building surrounded by high fences. St. Jude's Institute for Special Needs. It looked like a school. It was in reality a warehouse for unwanted children. "Dr. Aris said they have a bed open," Vanessa lied smoothly. "It is the best facility in the state. They have specialists. Therapies we cannot provide. If we send him there, he will be safe. And we can finally start our life, Julian. We can have a home without the screaming, without the chaos." Julian looked at the brochure. He looked at the picture of the smiling nurses. He thought of the toy car crashing to the floor and his son not even blinking. He thought of the silence that had swallowed his life. He felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it almost knocked him over. He was tired of fighting. He was tired of hoping. "Maybe you are right," he whispered, his voice defeated. "I am failing him here." "You are saving him," Vanessa corrected, pressing a pen into his hand. "Sign the transfer papers, darling. Do it for Leo. Do it for us." Julian hesitated. The pen hovered over the paper. He looked at the door as if waiting for someone to burst in and stop him. But the house was silent. Simone was gone. The hope was gone. He lowered the pen and signed his name. Vanessa watched the ink dry, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her face as she leaned in to kiss his cheek. "It is for the best," she whispered against his ear. And for the first time all night, she wasn't lying. It was certainly the best thing for her. The fluorescent lights of City General Hospital hummed with a low headache-inducing buzz. Simone adjusted the collar of the blue scrubs she had stolen from a laundry cart near the loading dock. It had been 2 years since she walked these halls as a doctor, but the muscle memory took over instantly. "Keep your head down, walk with purpose, carry a clipboard. If you look like you belong, no one questions you." She navigated the labyrinth of corridors, bypassing the nurses' station and heading straight for the basement archives. The air down here was cooler, smelling of old paper and dust. She stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She didn't knock. She tapped a rhythmic code on the metal frame. 1-2, 1-2-3. The door cracked open. A man with thick glasses and a nervous sweat on his upper lip peered out. Marcus. He was an archivist she had saved from a firing committee years ago. He owed her. "You are insane for coming here," Marcus hissed, pulling her inside and locking the door quickly behind her. "If administration sees you, they will call security. You are blacklisted, Simone." "I need a file," Marcus, Simone said, cutting through his panic. "I do not have time to argue. I need the newborn screening records for Leo Thorne, born 6 years ago. May 12th. Marcus shook his head vigorously. "I cannot do that." The Thorne family files are sealed, high-priority privacy encryption. If I access that, it leaves a digital footprint. I will lose my pension. A child is being tortured, Simone said. Her voice was ice cold. She stepped closer, invading his personal space. You know why I lost my license. You know I stood up for patients who couldn't speak. I am doing it again. If you don't help me, a little boy is going to disappear into a system that will bury him alive. Is your pension worth that? Marcus stared at her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the exhaustion, the fire. He cursed under his breath and turned to his computer terminal. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Green code cascaded down the black screen. He bypassed the initial security wall. He entered the archive retrieval query. Thorne Leo. The screen buffered. Simone held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Got it, Marcus whispered. He clicked the file. The medical history opened. Simone leaned in her eyes, scanning the data rapidly. She skipped the weight, the length, the APGAR scores. She went straight to the audiology report, the newborn hearing screening, the automated auditory brainstem response test. There it was, right there in black and white pixels. Right ear pass, left ear pass, diagnostic note, normal auditory function, no abnormalities detected. Simone let out a gasp that sounded like a sob. She grabbed Marcus's shoulder. Print it now. Marcus hit the command. The printer whirred to life. Simone snatched the paper before the ink was even dry. She stared at it, her hands trembling. Vanessa had shown Julian a chart that said congenital sensorineural hearing loss. She had told him Leo was born broken. She had built an entire narrative around his disability to make Julian feel helpless, to make him rely on her. But it was all a lie. Leo had been born perfect. This meant the deafness wasn't nature. It was inflicted. It was injury. And if it was injury, it could be healed. Simone folded the paper and tucked it into her bra close to her heart. She looked at Marcus. Wipe the search history. I already am, he said, his face pale. Go, before they find us. Simone slipped back into the hallway. She walked past a security guard who didn't even look at her. She exited the hospital into the cool night air, the stolen document burning against her skin. She had the proof. Now she just had to get to the boy before they took him away forever. The clock on the wall ticked like a bomb, counting down to an explosion. Simone paced the small floor of her apartment. The stolen medical record burned a hole in her pocket, but a piece of paper could not stop a moving van. She needed to get this to Julian, but he had blocked her number, and the security at the gate had her photo pinned up like a wanted criminal. She was a ghost to them, a ghost they wanted to exorcise. She turned on the small television in the corner. The local news was playing a puff piece. The anchor was smiling too wide. Tonight, the elite of the city gather at the Thorne estate for the annual Children's Future Gala, hosted by the lovely Vanessa Sterling. Simone froze. The gala. Tonight. It made perfect sense. Vanessa was a creature of optics. She would use the noise and the music and the flow of hundreds of guests as cover. While the world watched her smile and raise a glass to charity, she would slip Leo out the back door and into a black van bound for that hellhole of an institution. No one would notice a missing child in the chaos. By the time the last guest left, Leo would be 100 miles away, sedated and alone. Panic flared hot in Simone's chest, but she forced it down. Panic was useless. Rage was fuel. She looked at the clock again. 7 p.m. The party started at 8. The transfer would likely happen during the main speech when all eyes were on the stage. That gave her less than 2 hours. She ran to her closet and threw open the door. She couldn't walk in as herself. She needed to be invisible again. She needed to be the thing rich people never looked at twice. The help. She found a pair of black slacks and a crisp white button-down shirt. It was the universal uniform of the service industry. She pulled her hair back tight, scraping it away from her face. She found a black face mask in her drawer. It would hide her nose and mouth. It would turn her into just another pair of hands holding a tray. She grabbed her medical bag. She took out the tuning fork and the otoscope. She hesitated, then slid them into the deep pocket of her slacks. They clinked softly against her thigh. Cold, heavy, essential. She folded the stolen birth record into a tiny square and shoved it into her bra. It was the only armor she had. She took one last look around her apartment. If this went wrong, she was going to jail. Breaking and entering, trespassing. Maybe worse if Vanessa spun the story right. But then she thought of Leo. She thought of his silent scream at the dinner table. She thought of the way he had looked at her when she held him, the only person who had ever made him feel safe. "I am coming for you, Leo," she whispered to the empty room. She grabbed her coat and slammed the door behind her. She ran down the stairs, skipping steps, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The night air hit her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She only felt the fire of a promise she intended to keep. The billionaire thought he had won. The wicked stepmother thought she was clever. But they had forgotten one thing. You never underestimate the woman who knows where the secrets are buried because she is the one who cleaned the closet. The Thorne estate was ablaze with light. From the bottom of the long, winding driveway, it looked less like a home and more like a golden cage. Limousines idled in a long, sleek line, depositing the city's elite onto the red carpet. They wore diamonds that cost more than Simone's entire neighborhood. They laughed with heads thrown back, their breath misting in the cold night air, oblivious to the crime happening under the very roof they were celebrating. Simone slipped through the service entrance near the kitchens. The air here was thick with the scent of roasted duck and caramelized sugar. It was a chaotic ballet of chefs shouting orders and waiters rushing with silver trays. No one looked at her. In her black slacks and crisp white shirt, with a black mask covering the lower half of her face, she was just another gear in the machine. She was invisible. It was the same invisibility that had let them hurt Leo for so long, but tonight, it was her weapon. She grabbed an empty tray from a stack near the dishwasher and pushed through the swinging doors into the ballroom. The noise hit her like a physical wave. A string quartet played something cheerful and light in the corner, struggling to be heard over the roar of conversation and the clinking of crystal flutes. It was a sea of velvet and silk. Vanessa stood in the center of it all, radiant in a shimmering silver gown that hugged her body like liquid mercury. She held a microphone, beaming at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," Vanessa said, her voice amplified and smooth as honey. "Tonight is about the children. It is about giving a voice to those who cannot speak for themselves." The crowd applauded. Simone felt bile rise in her throat. The hypocrisy was suffocating. They were clapping for a woman who was actively silencing the only child who actually mattered in this house. Simone lowered her head and weaved through the guests. "Excuse me, pardon me." She moved with the fluid grace of a ghost, dodging elbows and spilled drinks. She spotted Julian near the bar. He wasn't smiling. He held a glass of whiskey like it was a shield, his eyes scanning the room with a vacant, haunted look. He looked like a man who was trying to drown a conscience that refused to die. Simone wanted to shake him. She wanted to scream the truth into his face right there in front of his donors. But she couldn't. Not yet. First, she had to save the boy. She slipped past the grand staircase where a security guard was checking badges. She knew the house better than he did. She ducked into a narrow alcove behind a tapestry and located the service stairwell. It was dark, cool, and silent. As she climbed, the music faded. The laughter turned into a dull, distant hum. By the time she reached the second floor, the glamour of the gala was gone. The hallway was empty. The shadows were long. It was cold up here. It felt abandoned. This was the reality of the Thorne estate. Downstairs was the performance. Upstairs was the prison. Simone moved quickly, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the runner. She counted the doors. 1, 2, 3. She stopped outside the nursery. There was no guard here. They didn't think they needed one. Who would come for a broken boy? She reached for the handle. It was locked from the outside. A simple key lock. Vanessa's cruelty was arrogant. She didn't think anyone would dare challenge her. Simone reached into her pocket and pulled out a thin metal pick she had fashioned from a paperclip in the cab ride over. She wasn't a thief, but desperation was a fast teacher. She slid the metal in. She jiggled it. A soft click echoed in the silence. She turned the knob and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. The room smelled of lavender air freshener, trying desperately to cover up the scent of sickness. It was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the moonlight, turning the nursery into a tomb. Simone moved toward the bed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Leo was there. He was lying on his back, staring up at the ceiling with glassy, unseeing eyes. His small chest rose and fell in a slow, unnatural rhythm. But it was his hands that made Simone stop dead in her tracks. They were bound. Soft silk scarves, likely stolen from Vanessa's own closet, were wrapped around his tiny wrists and tied to the wooden slats of the bed frame. They were loose enough not to leave bruises that would raise questions, but tight enough to keep a 6-year-old boy from getting up. It was not a bed. It was an operating table. It was a cell. Leo, Simone whispered, rushing to his side. She reached for his face, her hands trembling. "Leo, honey, wake up. It is me. It is Simone." Leo blinked. His head lulled to the side, his gaze drifting toward her. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a drugged haze. He let out a low, soft moan, a sound of discomfort that he couldn't articulate. Vanessa had sedated him. She had drugged a child to keep him compliant for the transfer. The rage that surged through Simone was so hot it almost blinded her, but she forced it down. She had to be a doctor now. She had to be clinical. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the otoscope. She clicked the light on. The beam cut through the darkness, a single shaft of truth in a room built on lies. "Hold still, Leo," she murmured, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I am just going to look. It is going to be okay." She gently pulled his earlobe back to straighten the canal. Leo flinched, a reflex of pain that pierced Simone's heart. He was hurting. He had been hurting for months and no one had known why. She leaned in, bringing the magnifying lens to her eye. At first, all she saw was inflammation. The skin of the ear canal was angry, swollen, and bright red. It was a sign of chronic irritation. But she went deeper. She adjusted the angle of the light, peering past the swelling, searching for the eardrum. She didn't find the eardrum. She found the wall. Packed deep inside the canal, jammed right up against the delicate membrane of the ear, was a dense mass of cotton. It wasn't clean white medical cotton. It was dark, stained yellow and brown. It was soaked in something. Simone sniffed the air near his ear. There was a faint, acrid chemical smell. Lidocaine. Maybe a high-concentration astringent. It was a primitive, brutal blockade. Vanessa was soaking cotton balls in a chemical solution to cause swelling and numbness, then jamming them deep into the boy's ears. It created a physical barrier to sound while simultaneously deadening the nerves and causing constant low-level pain. It mimicked the symptoms of severe hearing loss and behavioral issues perfectly. The boy wasn't screaming because he was crazy. He was screaming because his head was on fire. Simone pulled back, her hand shaking as she clicked off the light. She felt sick. This wasn't just neglect. This was torture. It was a calculated daily assault on a child to steal his inheritance. She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a pair of long, thin forceps. She needed proof. She needed to extract the evidence before they moved him. "I am so sorry, Leo," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "This is going to hurt, but I have to get it out. I have to show your father what she did to you." She leaned in again, the forceps glinting in the dim light. She had seconds, maybe minutes. She had to be fast, and she had to be perfect. One slip, and she could damage his hearing permanently. But if she left it in, they would win. She took a breath, steadied her hand, and went in. The metal tip of the forceps hovered at the entrance of the ear canal. Simone held her breath. Her hand, usually steady as a rock, fought against the adrenaline coursing through her veins. One wrong move, one sudden jerk from the drugged boy, and she could puncture the delicate skin, or worse, damage the drum she was trying to save. Leo let out a low, guttural moan in his sleep. The sedative was wearing off just enough for him to feel the intrusion. Simone whispered a silent prayer. "Just give me 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds." She advanced the instrument. The steel jaws of the forceps gripped the edge of the obstruction. It was impacted tight, wedged in like a cork in a bottle. Vanessa must have used a tool to push it this deep. The cruelty of the action made Simone's vision blur with red-hot anger, but she blinked it away. Rage was for later. Precision was for now. She squeezed the forceps and pulled. There was a sickening, wet resistance. The cotton had fused with the wax and the inflamed tissue. Leo thrashed his head to the side, a sharp cry escaping his lips. Simone moved with him, keeping her hand flexible so the metal wouldn't tear him. "I have got it," she whispered, sweat beading on her forehead. "Almost there." With one final steady tug, the mask gave way. It slid out of the ear canal with a faint squelching sound. Simone pulled it into the light of her otoscope. It was a nightmare in miniature. The cotton ball was no longer white. It was black, hardened by old blood wax and the chemical residue of the numbing agent. It was dense and heavy, a physical wall designed to shut out the world. The smell coming off it was sharp and medicinal, the undeniable scent of lidocaine and astringent. Simone dropped the vial lump into a small clear plastic specimen vial she had brought from her kit. She snapped the lid shut tight. There it was, the evidence. This wasn't a medical anomaly. This wasn't a birth defect. This was a weapon. She shoved the vial deep into her pocket next to her phone. Julian would see this. The police would see this. The whole world would see what the future Mrs. Thorne had been shoving into the head of a 6-year-old boy. Leo was breathing hard now, his hand flying up to cup his ear. He looked confused, his eyes darting around the room. The pressure was gone. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, muffled silence of a blockage. It was the open, waiting silence of a room. Simone didn't have time to comfort him. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the second item she had brought. It was heavy, cold, and made of brushed steel, a medical tuning fork. It looked like a simple two-pronged fork, but to an audiologist it was the ultimate truth-teller. It operated on physics, not biology. When struck, it vibrated at exactly 512 hertz. If she placed the base of the fork against the mastoid bone behind the ear, the sound would bypass the ear canal entirely. It would travel through the skull directly to the cochlea. If the nerve was dead, as Vanessa claimed, Leo would feel the vibration but hear nothing. But if the nerve was alive, if the deafness was only a lie created by that black cotton plug, the sound would ring in his head like a church bell. Simone gripped the handle of the fork. It felt like a sword in her hand. This was her gavel. This was her verdict. She looked at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. She could hear the faint sounds of the party downstairs, the laughter, the music, the celebration of a lie. She looked back at Leo. He was watching her. His gaze locked on the shiny metal object in her hand. "Let us see what you can really hear," Simone whispered. She raised the tuning fork, ready to strike it, ready to shatter the silence once and for all. But before she could swing, the doorknob turned. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a dull thud that shattered the fragile silence. Vanessa stood framed in the light of the hallway, a silhouette of silver silk and malice. Behind her loomed a man the size of a vending machine, his suit straining against muscles built for violence. He held a small duffel bag in one hand, the travel kit for a child who wasn't coming back. Vanessa stepped into the room, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. She expected a sedated boy. Instead, she saw a figure in black and white standing over the bed holding a shining metal instrument. For a split second, confusion clouded her face. Then the light from the hallway hit Simone's eyes above the black mask. Recognition struck Vanessa like a physical slap. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "It is you," Vanessa hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You filthy little rat. I knew you would come back." She didn't wait for an answer. She snapped her fingers at the bodyguard. "Grab her. Do not let her leave this room. And get that vial she put in her pocket." The bodyguard lunged. He moved with terrifying speed for a man of his size. His hand, heavy and thick, swiped through the air where Simone's head had been a fraction of a second before. Simone ducked, adrenaline flooding her system with cold, sharp clarity. She didn't try to fight him. She couldn't win that fight. She dove toward the gap between the bodyguard and the doorframe. He grabbed the back of her shirt. The fabric tore with a loud rip, but she twisted violently, spinning out of his grip. She stumbled into the hallway, her feet scrabbling for traction on the polished wood. "Get her!" Vanessa shrieked, her gala composure cracking into hysteria. "She has evidence. Stop her before she gets downstairs." Simone sprinted. Her breath tore at her lungs. She could hear the heavy, thundering footsteps of the bodyguard behind her, gaining ground with every stride. The hallway stretched out like an endless tunnel of expensive carpet and closed doors. She knew this house. She knew every creak, every turn, every hiding spot. She had scrubbed these floors on her hands and knees. She took a sharp left toward the service corridor, hoping to lose him in the narrow passages. But the bodyguard was faster than she anticipated. He cut the corner, blocking her path. Simone skidded to a halt, her shoes squeaking on the floor. He grinned, a humorless baring of teeth, and reached for her. She didn't think. She reacted. She grabbed a Ming vase from a pedestal table beside her, a priceless antique worth more than her life earnings, and hurled it at his face. He threw his arms up to deflect it. The vase shattered against his forearms, ceramic shrapnel raining down. It bought her 2 seconds. She spun around and bolted in the opposite direction toward the main gallery. The sounds of the party drifted up from the grand foyer below, the string quartet, playing a waltz, the murmur of polite conversation. It sounded like a different world, a world where children weren't tortured and maids weren't hunted. She reached the railing of the mezzanine balcony. Below her, hundreds of guests mingled, oblivious. Julian was there, standing near the center, looking up as if he sensed the disturbance. Simone looked back. The bodyguard was recovering, shaking glass from his sleeves, his face red with fury. Vanessa was running behind him, her heels clacking like gunshots, her face a portrait of panic. They were going to kill her. If they caught her up here in the shadows, she would disappear just like the evidence in her pocket. There was only one way out. She had to bring the war to them. She had to make a scene so big they couldn't hide it. Simone didn't run away from the edge. She ran toward it. She vaulted over the velvet rope blocking the grand staircase and began to descend, not as a servant but as a storm. The bodyguard roared and charged after her, abandoning all subtlety. The chase spilled out of the shadows and into the light of the crystal chandelier. The bodyguard's hand was a steel trap around Simone's ankle. She didn't even have time to scream before she was yanked backward, her body slamming onto the plush runner of the landing. The impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping for air as the massive man hauled her to her feet by the back of her shirt. The fabric cut into her underarms, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold dread washing over her. She had failed. She hadn't made it to the floor. She hadn't made it to Julian. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, her chest heaving, her silver gown shimmering like the scales of a snake. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with a mixture of panic and triumph. She looked down at the ballroom, then back at Simone, and a cruel idea sparked in her gaze. She wouldn't just hide this. She would use it. She would turn this intrusion into a performance that would bury Simone forever. "Bring her," Vanessa hissed at the guard. "Bring her down. Let everyone see what she is." The guard shoved Simone forward. Vanessa grabbed her arm, her nails digging deep into the flesh, and together they dragged her down the grand staircase. It was a grotesque procession. Simone stumbled, her feet tangling, but the guard held her up, forcing her to descend into the pit of judgment below. Vanessa waited until they were halfway down, visible to every single person in the room, before she unleashed her weapon. She let out a scream so piercing, so terrified that it silenced the string quartet instantly. "Help!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Security! Someone help us!" The gala ground to a halt. 300 guests turned in unison. The clinking of champagne flutes stopped. The polite laughter died, all eyes locked on the spectacle on the stairs. They saw their hostess, the beautiful and charitable Vanessa Sterling, looking disheveled and frantic. They saw a brute of a guard restraining a woman in a black and white uniform who looked wild, desperate, and dangerous. She tried to take him, Vanessa yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Simone. She broke into the nursery. She was trying to kidnap my son. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The word kidnap hung in the silence like smoke. It was the ultimate accusation, the one crime that turned a person into a monster in the eyes of the elite. The crowd recoiled. Faces that had been bored or amused twisted into expressions of disgust and horror. They didn't see a doctor fighting for a patient. They saw a criminal. They saw a threat. Julian pushed through the crowd near the bar, his face draining of color. He dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, but no one looked down. His eyes were fixed on the stairs. He saw Vanessa sobbing. He saw the guard. And then he saw Simone. The look on his face broke her heart. It wasn't anger. It was devastation. He looked at her like she was a stranger who had stabbed him in the back. He believed it. In that split second, surrounded by his peers, confronted with the hysteria of his fiancée, he believed the lie. Julian Vanessa cried, running down the last few steps and throwing herself into his arms. Thank God. She is crazy. She has a weapon. Tell them to arrest her. Tell them to take her away before she kills us all. The guard dragged Simone to the bottom of the stairs, forcing her to her knees in front of the crowd. She was surrounded. The wealthy, the powerful, the judgmental. They loomed over her, a wall of tuxedos and gowns. She was trapped in the center of the lion's den, and the lion tamer was calling for her head. Julian stepped forward, pulling away from Vanessa. He walked up to Simone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked down at her, his eyes cold and dead. Why he whispered the single word carrying more weight than all of Vanessa's screaming. Why did you come back? Simone looked up at him. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold steel of the tuning fork. She had one chance. One move left on the board. I didn't come back for you, she said, her voice ringing clear in the silence. I came back because you are too blind to see that your son is screaming for help. Julian stared at her with eyes that were no longer human. They were voids of cold, hard judgment. The heartbreak she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable fury. He did not see the woman who had made his son laugh for the first time in years. He saw a threat. He saw a chaotic element that had infiltrated his sanctuary and turned his life into a public spectacle. He motioned to the guards with a sharp, cutting gesture of his hand. Get her out of my sight! Julian commanded, his voice low and trembling with restrained violence. Throw her in the street, and if she ever steps foot near this property again, I want her arrested for trespassing and assault. The guards tightened their grip on Simone's arms. Their fingers dug into her biceps, bruising the skin. They hauled her up, dragging her backward across the polished marble floor. Her heels scraped against the stone, a screeching sound that made the guests wince. Vanessa stood behind Julian, her face buried in a handkerchief, but Simone could see the triumph radiating off her. She had won. She had painted Simone as the villain and herself as the victim, and Julian had bought every single brushstroke of the lie. Simone fought against the momentum. She dug her heels in. She was not leaving. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. Not while Leo was upstairs with cotton rotting in his ears. She looked at Julian, who was turning his back on her, ready to apologize to his guests and smooth over the ugly scene. Julian, she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and desperate. He did not turn. He kept walking away. You are a failure, Simone yelled. That stopped him. The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. A billionaire is called many things. Ruthless, arrogant, powerful, but never a failure. Julian froze. His shoulders stiffened. He turned around slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say to me?" he whispered, the quiet menace in his voice, carrying further than her shout. Simone stopped struggling against the guards. She stood tall, panting, her hair wild, her uniform torn, but her eyes burning with a fire that eclipsed every diamond in the room. "I said you are a failure," she repeated, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "You built an empire, you conquered markets, you command thousands of people, but you cannot protect the one thing that actually belongs to you. You are letting a stranger drag your son away to a warehouse for broken children because you are too cowardly to look at the truth. How dare you?" Julian snarled, taking a step toward her. "You know nothing about my son." "I know he is not deaf," Simone shouted back. "I know because I checked. I know because I looked inside his ears when you were too busy looking at her." She jerked her head toward Vanessa. Vanessa's face went pale. She grabbed Julian's arm. "Do not listen to her, Julian. She is deranged. Get her out, now." But Simone did not stop. She leaned into the restraint of the guards, her eyes locked on Julian's soul. "If you let them drag me out of here without checking his ears one last time, then you are not a father. You are just a man with a checkbook. And you will have to live with the fact that you failed him every single day for the rest of your life." The challenge hung between them. It was an ultimatum, it was an insult, and it was the only thing that could have pierced the armor of his pride. Julian looked at her. He looked at the desperation in her face, and for the first time he hesitated. Simone ripped her arm free from the guard's loosened grip with a burst of strength born from pure adrenaline. Before they could seize her again, she plunged her hand into her pocket and whipped out the object. It flashed under the chandelier light. Cold, silver, U-shaped. It hummed faintly as it cut through the air. Vanessa screamed, "She has a knife! Shoot her!" The guards drew their tasers, the crowd shrieked and surged back in a wave of panicked silk and velvet. But Julian did not flinch. He stared at the object in Simone's hand. It was not a knife, it was not a weapon. It was a piece of medical steel, a tuning fork. "Give me 30 seconds, Simone shouted. Her voice cracked with the sheer force of her desperation. She held the fork up like a holy relic in the center of the ballroom. 30 seconds, Julian. That is all I ask. Bring the boy here. Let me do one test. One simple test." Julian stared at her. The room was spinning. The music had stopped. The waiters were frozen. Every eye in New York high society was fixed on them, waiting for the execution or the pardon. "If I am wrong," Simone continued, her eyes locking onto his with a ferocity that burned hotter than the lights. "If I do this and he does not react, then you can arrest me. You can put me in prison for the rest of my life. You can shoot me right here on this floor and I will not complain. I will accept my fate. But if I am right and you send him away without knowing, then you are burying your own son alive." Vanessa grabbed Julian's arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Do not listen to her, Julian. This is a trick. She is mentally unstable. Look at her. She is waving metal around like a lunatic. She is trying to humiliate us. Send her away, please." But the crowd had shifted. The silence wasn't fearful anymore. It was expectant. They were watching a drama unfold that was more compelling than any opera they had paid thousands to see. Someone in the back, a donor with a conscience, murmured loud enough to be heard, "Let her do it." Another voice joined in, "Check the boy." The pressure mounted. It pressed against Julian's chest like a physical weight. If he sent her away now, he would look like a coward. He would look like a man afraid of the truth. He looked at the tuning fork. He looked at Simone's face, streaked with sweat and dirt, but shining with absolute conviction. He realized in that moment that no liar would risk their life with this much certainty. He made a decision. He raised his hand and signaled the guards, "Stand down." The guards stepped back, lowering their weapons. Vanessa gasped, her face draining of all color, her grip on his arm turning painful. "Julian, no. Bring him." Julian ordered, his voice cold and flat. "Bring Leo here, now." He turned his gaze back to Simone. It was not a gaze of friendship. It was a gaze of warning. "You have 30 seconds," he said. "And if this is a trick, I will destroy you." Simone nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just gripped the tuning fork tighter until the metal bit into her palm. "Bring him," she whispered, "and pray that I am right." The heavy oak doors at the top of the stairs creaked open. A hush fell over the ballroom, so complete it felt as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. A nursemaid walked down the steps carrying Leo. The boy looked small and pale, his eyes darting around the sea of strangers with terrified confusion. He did not know why he was there. He did not know why his father was looking at him with such desperate intensity. He only knew that the air tasted like fear. "Put him down," Julian ordered, his voice tight. The nursemaid set Leo on his feet in the center of the circle the crowd had formed. He stood there trembling in his pajamas, a tiny island of vulnerability in an ocean of judgment. He saw Simone and his shoulders dropped an inch. He took a hesitant step toward her, his hands reaching out. She was the only safety he knew. Simone dropped to her knees. She didn't rush. She moved with the calm, deliberate grace of a surgeon entering an operating theater. She ignored Vanessa, who was breathing hard through her nose like a cornered animal. She ignored Julian, who stood like a statue of ice. Her world narrowed down to the boy and the metal instrument in her hand. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear the words through the cotton packed in his ears. She smiled, a soft, reassuring expression that reached her eyes. She needed him to trust her. She needed him to be still. She raised the tuning fork. It gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, a piece of cold medical steel that looked out of place against the silk and velvet of the gala. The room held its collective breath. 300 people watching one woman gamble her life on a vibration. Simone turned her wrist and struck the prongs of the fork hard against the marble edge of a side table. The sound rang out. It was a pure, high-pitched hum, clear and resonant. It sliced through the silence of the ballroom, a singular note of truth. It vibrated in the air, humming with energy. Vanessa flinched. Julian leaned forward, his eyes burning. Simone didn't hesitate. She didn't hold the fork near Leo's ear canal. She knew that path was blocked. She knew the cotton and the swelling would stop any air-conducted sound dead in its tracks. She was counting on something deeper. She was counting on biology. With a firm, decisive movement, she pressed the metal stem of the vibrating fork directly against the mastoid bone behind Leo's left ear. It was a technique known as bone conduction. The vibration would bypass the outer ear entirely. It would travel through the hard bone of the skull, shaking the cochlea, directly stimulating the auditory nerve that Vanessa claimed was dead. If the nerve was alive, the sound wouldn't just be heard. It would be felt. It would resonate inside his head like a bell ringing in a canyon. Simone held the fork steady, her hand rock solid, pressing the metal into his skin. She watched his face. She watched his eyes. And she waited for the miracle. The contact was electric. For months, Leo had lived in a world of muffled gray static, a sensory prison built of cotton and chemicals, where the only sound was the rushing of his own blood. But this was clear. This was sharp. This was undeniable. The vibration traveled through the mastoid bone like a lightning bolt made of sound, bypassing the inflamed canal and the blockade Vanessa had built. It hit the cochlea directly, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the world broke through. Leo's eyes snapped open. They didn't just widen, they ignited. The glassy, drugged haze that had clouded his gaze for hours vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath that echoed in the silent ballroom. His small hands flew up, not to cover his ears, but to touch the air around him, as if he could grab the sound he was feeling inside his skull. He turned his head. It was a sharp, deliberate movement. He whipped his face toward the tuning fork, his eyes locking onto the humming metal. He was tracking it. He was hunting the sound. Simone held her breath, tears streaming down her face behind the mask. He hears it, she whispered. Then Leo did something that stopped the hearts of 300 people. He opened his mouth. His throat worked against the dryness, his vocal cords rusty from disuse and pain. He looked at Simone. Then he looked past her, his gaze landing squarely on his father. He reached out a trembling hand. "Bah," he croaked. It was a broken sound. It was guttural and wet and weak. But it was a word. It was an attempt at language from a boy who was supposed to have a dead nerve. "Ba-ba." The sound tore through the room like a physical blow. A woman in the front row covered her mouth and started to weep. The security guards lowered their armed stun guns forgotten at their sides. The truth was no longer a theory. It was a living, breathing thing standing in the center of the room in pajamas. Julian Thorne crumbled. The strength that had held up a billion-dollar empire, the arrogance that had allowed him to dismiss a maid, the certainty that had let him sign his son away, all of it evaporated in a single second. His knees hit the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud. He didn't even put his hands out to break his fall. He simply collapsed under the weight of his own blindness. He stared at his son, his mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. He looked at the boy reaching for him, the boy who could hear him, the boy he had almost thrown away. A sound ripped from Julian's throat, a jagged animal noise of pure devastation. It was the sound of a man realizing he had been the villain in his own life story. He crawled forward. He didn't walk. He crawled on his hands and knees toward the child, tears blinding him, his expensive tuxedo ruining on the floor. He reached out his hands, shaking so violently he could barely control them. "Leo," he choked out. "Oh my God, Leo!" The boy looked at him, confused by the tears but still tracking the sound of his father's voice. The connection was made. The lie was dead. And in the center of the ruin, Simone stood tall, the tuning fork still humming in her hand like the sword of justice. The spell of shock that held the room captive broke the moment Vanessa moved. She did not move with grace. She moved with the frantic, jerky desperation of a woman watching her future disintegrate. Her silver gown rustled violently as she lunged forward, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of panic on the marble. She reached for Leo not to comfort him, but to possess him. She needed to cover his mouth. She needed to stop the sounds that were destroying her life. "It is a trick," she shrieked, her voice shrill and unhinged. She grabbed Leo's shoulder, her fingernails digging into his pajamas. "It is just a reflex. He is having a spasm. Can you not see that he is seizing? He does not know what he is saying." She yanked the boy backward, away from Julian, away from the truth. Leo cried out a confused, frightened sound and flinched away from her touch. He knew those hands. He knew they meant pain. "Stop it!" Vanessa yelled at the crowd, her eyes wild. "Stop looking at him. He is sick. I need to take him upstairs. I need to give him his medicine." But she never got the chance. Simone stepped in. She moved with the speed of a striking cobra. She slammed her body between Vanessa and the boy, breaking Vanessa's grip with a sharp upward thrust of her arm. She didn't shove her this time. She simply occupied the space with such ferocity that Vanessa was forced to stumble back. "Do not touch him," Simone said. Her voice was not a scream, it was a judgment. "You will never touch him again." Vanessa snarled, her face twisting. "Get out of my way, you filth. You rigged this. You are doing something to him with that metal stick." "I am not doing anything," Simone said, holding her ground. "I am undoing what you did." Simone reached into her pocket with her free hand. She pulled out the small, clear plastic vial she had filled in the nursery. She held it up high, catching the light of the chandeliers. Inside, the blackened, wax-coated mass of cotton looked like a dead insect trapped in amber. It was ugly. It was visceral. It was undeniable. "You want to know why he could not hear?" Simone announced, turning the vial so the light hit the dark stain inside. "You want to know why he screamed in his sleep? It wasn't nature. It wasn't a defect. It was this." She took a step toward Julian, who was still on his knees staring at his son. She thrust the vial toward him. "Look at it," Julian, Simone commanded. "Look at what your fiancé pulled out of her vanity drawer and shoved into your son's skull." Vanessa lunged for the vial, her hands clawing at the air. "Give that to me! That is mine!" Simone pulled it back out of reach. "It is evidence," she said coldly. "It is cotton soaked in lidocaine and astringent." Simone continued, her voice projecting to the back of the room. She packed it against his eardrums to block the sound and numb the pain so he wouldn't claw it out. She turned him into a prisoner in his own body, just so she could send him away and cash a check. The crowd recoiled. A collective murmur of revulsion swept through the room. The elegance of the gala dissolved into the grotesque reality of child abuse. Vanessa looked around, seeing the faces of her friends, her donors, her social circle turning into masks of disgust. She realized her narrative was dead. The reflex lie hadn't worked. The medical lie hadn't worked. She was exposed. She looked at Julian, desperate to salvage the one connection that mattered. "Julian, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a tearful whisper. "She is planting it. She is trying to frame me. You know I love him." But the vial in Simone's hand was a black hole sucking in every lie Vanessa had ever told. And as Julian looked from the horrific object to the woman he was supposed to marry, the last remnant of his blindness fell away. "You asked who I am," Simone said, her voice projecting to the back of the room, commanding the attention of every billionaire and socialite in the hall. "I am not just the woman who scrubs your floors. I am Dr. Simone Jackson. I was the chief resident of pediatric audiology at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I spent 10 years studying the intricate mechanics of the human ear before my license was revoked for exposing a surgeon who valued profit over patience. I know exactly what I am looking at, and I know exactly what she did." She pointed a trembling finger at Vanessa, who was now backed against the grand staircase, her chest heaving with panic. "You were told your son had congenital sensorineural hearing loss," Simone continued, turning back to Julian. "That means the nerve is dead. That means the wire is cut, and no signal can get through." But that was a lie. Leo's auditory nerve is perfectly healthy. It is alive. It is waiting for sound. Simone held up the vial containing the blackened cotton again. What she did was create a wall. She caused severe otitis externa. She induced chronic inflammation in the ear canal using chemical irritants. Then she packed this cotton deep inside, right against the tympanic membrane. It created a conductive hearing loss. It is like nailing a door shut and telling everyone the house is empty. The sound could not get in through the air, so he seemed deaf. But the bone, Julian, the bone does not lie. When I used the tuning fork, the vibration traveled through his skull, bypassed her blockade, and hit the nerve directly. That is why he heard it. That is why he spoke. Julian stared at her, his face a mask of shattered comprehension. He looked at the vial, then at his son, understanding for the first time that the silence had been inflicted, not inherited, but why he whispered. Why would she do this? "Because a deaf child is a burden you would pay to send away," Simone said. She reached into her shirt and pulled out the folded paper she had stolen from the hospital archives. She snapped it open and shoved it into Julian's shaking hands. "Read it. This is the original newborn screening report from City General. Look at the date. Look at the results." Julian looked down. His eyes scanned the crinkled paper. He saw Leo's name, he saw the birth date, and he saw the words that condemned his fiancée to hell. Bilateral pass. Normal auditory function. He was born perfect. Simone said, her voice breaking with emotion. He could hear the rain. He could hear your voice. He could hear everything until she decided he was worth more to her as a tragedy than as a son. She forged the records, Julian. She paid off a corrupt specialist to switch the files, and she has been torturing him every single day to keep up the ruse. Vanessa let out a strangled cry. "That is fake," she screamed. "She printed that off the internet. She is lying to you, Julian." But Julian was not looking at Vanessa anymore. He was staring at the paper in his hands, his knuckles turning white as the paper tore under his grip. The truth was not just in the words. It was in the logic. It was in the cotton. It was in the voice of the boy who had just called him father. The pieces slammed together in his mind, forming a picture so horrific it made his knees buckle. He had almost signed the papers. He had almost sent a healthy, abused child to an institution because he was too busy being a CEO to be a dad. He looked up at Simone. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, bottomless gratitude mixed with horror. "You saved him," he breathed. "I did what you should have done," Simone replied, her voice hard. "I looked." Julian took the plastic vial from Simone's hand. The object felt incredibly light, yet it seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. He held it up to the light, staring at the blackened, compressed mass inside. It was a physical manifestation of his own negligence. Slowly, with fingers that felt numb and disconnected from his body, he popped the small snap lid. He raised it to his nose and inhaled. The scent was unmistakable. It was not the smell of infection or decay. It was the sharp, sterile chemical sting of high-grade medical anesthetic mixed with the acrid bite of industrial astringent. It smelled like a hospital operating room. It smelled like a lie. Julian snapped the lid shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He lowered his hand and turned his head slowly toward the staircase. Vanessa was standing there, clutching her silver gown, tears streaming down her face. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped. Her eyes were wide, pleading, begging him to look away, begging him to find an excuse. But Julian did not look away. He looked at her with a clarity that was terrifying. He saw the woman he had invited into his bed. He saw the woman he had trusted with his son. And for the first time, he saw the predator beneath the skin. "Stop crying," Julian said. His voice was not loud. It was a dead thing. It had no warmth, no anger, just a cold, flat emptiness. Vanessa's sobbing hitched. She saw the change in his eyes. She saw the adoration vanish, replaced by a revulsion so deep it made her flinch. She realized in that split second that the performance was over. The curtain had fallen. There was no more script to follow. Her posture changed instantly. The trembling ceased. The tears stopped flowing as if she had turned off a tap. She straightened her spine, wiping her face with the back of her hand, smearing her expensive makeup into a grotesque mask. The fear in her eyes hardened into something brittle and sharp. It was the look of a cornered rat that had decided to bite. "Do not look at me like that," she spat, her voice changing from a wail to a snarl. "Do not look at me like I am the villain here. I did this for you." "For me," Julian whispered, stepping toward her. "You tortured my son for me." "I did it for our future," Vanessa screamed. She threw her arms out, gesturing to the opulent room, to the shocked guests, to the life they were supposed to share. "Look at him, Julian. Look at that boy. He is a millstone around your neck. He is a broken, damaged thing that drags you down." The crowd gasped, but Vanessa was past caring about the audience. She was fighting for her justification. "I was trying to set you free," she yelled, her face twisting with ugliness. "You were drowning in guilt over him. You were letting his disability ruin your life. I gave you a way out. I gave you a solution. We could have sent him away to that school, and he would have been happy, and we would have been free. I did the hard work. I did the dirty work that you were too weak to do." She pointed a shaking finger at Leo, who was cowering behind Simone. "He is a burden," she shrieked. "He is a useless, stuttering burden who would have drained your trust fund and ruined our happiness. I was protecting our legacy. I was protecting the money. I was the only one in this house thinking about what was best for us." Julian stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at her, listening to the poison spill from her lips. He realized with a sick lurch in his stomach that she truly believed it. She didn't see a child. She saw an obstacle. She saw a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. "Is that what you think?" Julian asked softly. "You think he is a burden?" "I think he is a mistake," Vanessa sneered, regaining her composure, standing tall on the steps, like a queen of ice. "And I was simply trying to correct it." You should be thanking me, not looking at me like I am some kind of monster. I am the only one who tried to save you from a life of babysitting a defect." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Vanessa stood there panting, waiting for Julian to see the logic in her cruelty. But all Julian saw was the devil he had almost married. Julian stared up at Vanessa with a look that could have frozen the blood in her veins. For a moment, the ballroom was dead silent, save for the ragged breathing of the woman on the stairs. She waited for him to break. She waited for him to see the twisted logic of her cruelty. But when Julian finally spoke, his voice was not the voice of a lover or a partner. It was the voice of a man who had built an empire from nothing and was currently looking at the worst investment of his life. "You are right about one thing," Vanessa Julian said, his words dropping like stones into deep water. "There was a mistake in this house, but it was not my son. It was you." He turned to the head of his security detail. The same men who had been holding Simone moments ago now looked uncertain, shifting their weight from foot to foot. "Seize her," Julian commanded. His tone brooked no argument. "I want her in restraints immediately." Vanessa's jaw dropped. She took a stumbling step back, clutching the banister. "Julian, you cannot be serious. You are letting this maid brainwash you. I am your fiancé." "You are nothing to me," Julian roared. The volume of his voice made the crystal glasses on the tables tremble. "You are a predator who preyed on a defenseless child. You are a fraud. And as of this second, you are trespassing in my home." The guards moved. They swarmed up the stairs with professional efficiency. Vanessa screamed as they grabbed her arms, pulling them roughly behind her back. She thrashed, kicking out with her heels, but they were merciless. They snapped a pair of plastic zip cuffs around her wrists, the sound tight and final. Julian walked to the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her with cold satisfaction. "You wanted my legacy, Vanessa. You wanted access to the Thorn fortune. Well, I promise you this. You are going to get it. I will use every dollar in my bank account. I will hire every lawyer in this city. I will spend my entire fortune if I have to, just to ensure that you spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell. I will bury you under so much litigation that you will never see the sun again." Vanessa was sobbing now, ugly hysterical tears running down her face. "Julian, please, I love you." "Do not say that word." Julian spat. "You do not know what love is. Give me the ring." He reached out his hand. The guards held her still while one of them wrenched the massive diamond engagement ring from her finger. He handed it to Julian. Julian looked at the sparkling stone, then looked at Simone. He tossed the ring onto the floor as if it were a piece of trash. Suddenly, the main doors of the ballroom burst open. Blue and red lights flashed against the high windows, washing the room in the colors of the law. A squad of uniformed police officers marched in, their radios crackling. "I called them," Simone said, stepping up beside Julian. Her voice was calm. "I called them the moment I found the cotton. I knew you would need help taking out the trash." Julian looked at Simone, and for the first time that night, a flicker of genuine respect crossed his face. He nodded slowly. Officer Julian called out, pointing to the woman screaming on the stairs. "That is the woman you want. I am pressing charges, all of them. Assault, child endangerment, fraud, attempted grievous bodily harm. Take her away." The police moved up the stairs, taking custody of Vanessa. She kicked and screamed, cursing Simone, cursing Julian, cursing the boy who had ruined her plans. But her screams faded as they dragged her out the front door and into the waiting cruiser. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise. Julian stood in the center of the room. The silence that returned was not heavy. It was clean. He turned slowly and looked at the small boy hiding behind Simone's legs. The nightmare was over. The waking up could finally begin. The police cars faded into the night, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise had ever been. The guests were still there, standing in small clusters, whispering among themselves. But Julian did not see them. He did not care about the scandal. He did not care about the whispers that would appear in the tabloids the next morning. His entire world had narrowed down to the woman standing in the center of the room and the small boy clinging to her leg. Simone looked exhausted. Her black and white uniform was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was coming loose from its bun, and there was a dark bruise forming on her arm where the guard had grabbed her. But she stood with a quiet dignity that made her look like the only royalty in the room. She was holding the tuning fork in one hand and the vial of evidence in the other, like a warrior holding her sword and shield. Julian walked toward her. His legs felt heavy. Every step was a struggle against the crushing weight of his own shame. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her hands, the hands that had scrubbed his floors and healed his son. He looked at her eyes, the eyes he had refused to meet when he threw her out into the rain. "Simone," he said. His voice was cracked and raw, a broken sound that barely carried across the gap between them. He did not wait for her to answer. He did not offer a handshake. He did something that caused a fresh ripple of shock to move through the watching crowd. Julian Thorne, the man who never bowed to anyone, slowly lowered himself to his knees. He knelt on the cold, hard marble of his own ballroom, right in front of the maid he had called a savage. He lowered his head, exposing his neck in a gesture of absolute submission and regret. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a mountain. "I was blind. I was so arrogant. I let a monster into our home, and I attacked the only person who was trying to fight it. I treated you like garbage. I called you names. I threw you out. And you still came back. You risked your freedom to save a boy who is not even yours. I do not deserve your forgiveness, Simone. I do not deserve to even look at you, but I am begging you to understand that I am sorry." He stayed there on his knees waiting for her judgment. He expected her to yell. He expected her to walk away. He would have accepted it. He would have accepted anything she chose to do to him, but Simone did not yell. She stepped back gently, disengaging Leo's gripping hands from her leg. She looked down at the billionaire kneeling at her feet. Her expression was not angry, but it was not soft either. It was the look of a doctor who knows the surgery is over, but the recovery has not yet begun. "Get up, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with crystal clarity. Julian looked up, confusion swimming in his tear-filled eyes. He started to speak again, to offer more excuses, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Do not apologize to me," she said, shaking her head slowly. "I am an adult. I can handle being fired. I can handle being insulted. My pride will heal. I did not do this for you." She stepped aside, revealing the small, trembling boy standing behind her. Leo was looking at his father with wide, fearful eyes, uncertain of what this new behavior meant. He had never seen his father this small before. Simone pointed at the child. "Apologize to him. He is the one you failed. He is the one who screamed for help while you were looking at ring designs. He is the one who had to live in silence because you trusted a pretty face more than your own flesh and blood. You do not owe me a thing, Julian, but you owe him everything. You need to earn his trust back, and that is going to take a lot more than kneeling on a floor." Julian looked from Simone to Leo. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. His sin wasn't firing a maid. His sin was abandoning his child. He shifted his weight, turning on his knees to face his son. He wiped his face, trying to look less like a monster and more like a dad. The road back was going to be long, but for the first time in years, he was finally facing the right direction. The sunlight poured through the blinds of the private recovery room at City General Hospital, bathing the space in a warm, golden glow. It was a sharp contrast to the cold, gray shadows of the Thorne estate. Here, everything was clean. Everything was transparent. There were no heavy curtains to hide secrets, and no locked doors to keep out the truth. Dr. Simone Jackson stood by the bedside. She was no longer wearing the gray uniform of a maid. She was dressed in a crisp white lab coat, her stethoscope around her neck, and her name embroidered in blue thread on the pocket. She looked like exactly what she was. A healer, a specialist, a woman who had reclaimed her life. She held a small, sleek device in her hands. It did not look like a traditional hearing aid. It was a soft headband with a small, sophisticated processor attached to it. It was a bone conduction hearing system. It was the answer they had been waiting for. Leo sat on the edge of the examination table, swinging his legs. The swelling in his ear canals had gone down significantly over the last 3 weeks, thanks to the antibiotics Simone had prescribed. The angry red inflammation caused by Vanessa's chemical cotton was fading into a healthy pink. But the canal was still tender. This device was perfect because it didn't need to go inside. It sat gently on the bone behind the ear, bypassing the damage entirely. Julian sat in a chair in the corner. He looked different. The arrogance that had worn him like a suit of armor was gone. He looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the exhaustion of a father who had spent every night sleeping in a hospital chair, refusing to leave his son's side. He watched Simone's hands with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Is he ready?" Julian asked, his voice thick with nervousness. "He is ready," Simone replied with a confident smile. She stepped forward and gently placed the headband around Leo's head. She adjusted the processor so the vibrating pad sat flush against his mastoid bone. Leo sat very still. He trusted her. She was the one who had taken the pain away. She was the one who had brought the silence to an end. Simone pulled out her tablet and tapped the screen, activating the device. She started the volume low, gradually bringing it up to a normal conversational level. Leo's eyes widened. It was not the sudden shock of the tuning fork test. This was different. This was clarity. For the first time, he wasn't just hearing a vibration. He was hearing texture. He heard the hum of the air conditioner. He heard the rustle of Simone's coat. He heard his own breath moving in and out of his lungs. He let out a small gasp and reached up to touch the band. He laughed. It was a bubbly, wet sound of pure discovery. "He can hear the ambient noise," Simone said softly, looking at Julian. "Now talk to him." Julian stood up. His hands were shaking. He walked to the edge of the bed and knelt down so he was eye level with his son. He had apologized 1,000 times while Leo was sleeping, but he had never been sure if the words were getting through. "Leo," Julian whispered. "Can you hear me?" Leo stopped laughing. He stared at his father's mouth. Then he stared at his eyes. The sound matched the movement. The voice was deep and warm and familiar. It was the voice that had read to him years ago before the silence came. Leo's face crumpled, not in sadness but in overwhelming recognition. His mouth worked, trying to remember the shapes of words he hadn't used in so long. He took a shaky breath. "Ba," Leo croaked. Julian froze. Tears spilled over his lashes, tracking down his unshaven cheeks. "Ba," Leo said again, louder this time, testing the vibration in his throat. "Daddy!" The word broke Julian completely. He reached out and pulled his son into his arms, burying his face in the boy's small shoulder. Leo wrapped his arms around his father's neck, holding on tight. Simone watched them from the foot of the bed. She slipped her tablet into her pocket. Her work here was done. She had fixed the ears. The love would fix the rest. She turned and walked quietly out of the room, leaving them to their miracle. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was loud and final. It echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap ending a long and suffocating drought. Vanessa Sterling stood in the defendant's box, but the glamour was gone. She was not wearing silk or diamonds. She was wearing the drab, ill-fitting gray uniform of state custody. Her hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her face, without the mask of expensive makeup, looked older and harder. The judge did not mince words. He called her actions calculated, cruel, and monstrous. He sentenced her to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for child endangerment fraud and attempted grievous bodily harm. As the bailiffs moved to cuff her hands, Vanessa did not scream. She did not look at the gallery where her former socialite friends were frantically taking notes for their blogs. She looked hollow. The ambition that had burned so brightly had consumed her, leaving nothing behind but ash. She was led away through the side door, vanishing into a world where her manipulation would earn her nothing but a solitary cell. Across the city, another verdict was being delivered, but this one was an apology. Simone sat in the high-backed leather chair of the State Medical Board's conference room. The chairman, a man who had once signed the order to strip her of her career, slid a heavy cream-colored envelope across the polished mahogany table. "We were wrong, Dr. Jackson," he said, his voice thick with regret. "We failed to investigate your claims 2 years ago because it was easier to silence you than to challenge a powerful surgeon. We are formally reinstating your medical license effective immediately. And the hospital would like to offer you your old position back as chief of audiology, with a significant raise, of course." Simone looked at the license. It was the piece of paper she had dreamed of reclaiming during those long nights scrubbing floors and eating instant noodles. It was her identity. It was her vindication. She reached out and touched the paper, but she did not pick it up. She thought of the hospital politics. She thought of the red tape. She thought of how easy it had been for them to discard her when she became inconvenient. "I appreciate the offer," Simone said, her voice steady and calm. "I accept the reinstatement of my license. I earned that. But I cannot work for you again." The chairman looked stunned. "But Simone, why? You could write your own ticket." "Because I have found a better way to help," she replied. She stood up and walked out of the conference room, leaving the stunned board members behind. She walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, where a familiar black sedan was waiting at the curb. Julian Thorne was leaning against the door. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a casual jacket, looking younger and lighter than he had in years. He opened the door for her. "How did it go?" he asked. "I got my license back," Simone smiled. "And I turned down the job." Julian grinned. "Good. Because I have a better one." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a portfolio. It was the charter for a new organization, the Leo Thorne Foundation for Pediatric Hearing. "I am liquefying a massive portion of my assets," Julian explained as they got into the car. "We are going to build clinics in the poorest neighborhoods. We are going to provide bone conduction implants, hearing aids, and therapy to every child who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay. But I need someone to run it. I need a medical director who knows that a patient is more than a chart." Simone looked at the plans. It was ambitious. It was massive. It was a chance to change thousands of lives, just like she had changed Leo's. "It will be hard work," Simone said, looking at him. "I know," Julian replied, starting the engine. "But I have the best partner in the world." Simone looked out the window as the car pulled away. She wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't just a doctor. She was a guardian. And for the first time in a long time, the future sounded like music. The late afternoon sun dappled through the canopy of the old oak trees, painting shifting patterns of light on the grass where Leo was crouched. He was no longer the pale ghost of a child who haunted the hallways of the Thorne estate. He was vibrant. He was alive. He wore denim overalls with grass stains on the knees and a bright red t-shirt that matched the flush in his cheeks. Around his head sat the sleek black band of the bone conduction hearing device, a piece of technology that had become his bridge to the world. Julian sat on the wooden park bench a few feet away. He had discarded the armor of his expensive 3-piece suits for a simple cashmere sweater and jeans. He held a coffee cup in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. He was watching his son with an intensity that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with wonder. He watched Leo pick up a dry leaf and crumble it near his ear, laughing as the crisp, crackling sound traveled through the device and into his mind. "It is loud today," Julian remarked softly, not taking his eyes off the boy. "It is a good kind of loud," Simone replied. She sat next to him, leaving a respectful distance between them on the bench. She wasn't wearing her doctor's coat, and she certainly wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a soft blue blouse that caught the color of the sky. Her hands rested mainly in her lap, no longer clenched in fists ready to fight a war. The war was over, the dragon had been slain, and the castle had been reclaimed. Julian turned to look at her. The shadows that had lived under his eyes for years had finally lifted. "I never realized how quiet the house was," he admitted, his voice low and reflective. "I thought the silence was peace. I thought it was order. But it wasn't. It was just empty. Now the house is full of noise. He bangs his toys. He sings along to the television. He yells when he is hungry. And every time I hear it, I feel like I have won the lottery." "You have," Simone said with a gentle smile. "You got the only prize that matters." Leo suddenly froze. He stood up straight, his head tilting to the side like a robin listening for a worm. A high melodic trill cut through the ambient noise of the park. It was a cardinal perched on a branch high above them, singing its territory song. Leo's eyes went wide. He pointed a small finger toward the tree. "Bird," he shouted. "Bah! Bird singing." Julian's face broke into a grin that reached his eyes. "Yes, Leo, it is a bird. It is singing for you." Simone watched the exchange. She watched the way Julian leaned in to validate his son's discovery. She watched the way Leo beamed with pride, knowing he had been heard. It wasn't the fairy tale ending of a romance novel. It was something realer. It was something stronger. They were a family not bound by blood alone, but forged in the fire of a crisis. They were a unit constructed from broken pieces that had been glued back together with truth and patience. Julian looked back at Simone. He didn't reach for her hand, not yet. But the look that passed between them was heavy with promise. It was an acknowledgement of a partnership that went deeper than any contract. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the noise, for the truth, for him." "You are welcome," Simone replied. She leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She listened to the wind rustling the leaves. She listened to the distant laughter of other children. And she listened to Leo singing back to the bird. Her work here was done. She had opened the door and let the sound in. And as she sat there in the golden light of the afternoon, Simone Jackson finally let herself just listen. The most profound lesson we can take from the story of the Thorne family is that the truth does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and it requires a fierce and brave heart to lean in and listen. Julian Thorne had all the money in the world. He had power. He had influence. But he was poor in the only currency that mattered, which was attention. He allowed himself to be blinded by a narrative that was painful, but easy to accept. It is often easier to believe that someone is broken than it is to do the hard work of finding out why. He accepted the diagnosis because it absolved him of the fight. But Simone teaches us that advocacy is the highest form of love. She stripped away the titles and the wealth and the noise. She looked at the child. She saw the person behind the symptoms. Her power did not come from a bank account. It came from her refusal to look away. We live in a world that is quick to label and quick to dismiss the things we do not understand. We are often surrounded by people who are screaming in silence, just like Leo was. They are waiting for someone to stop looking at the charts and start looking at their eyes. They are waiting for someone to pick up a tuning fork and test the vibration of their soul. The tragedy wasn't that Leo was hurt. The tragedy was that he was almost lost because the people who should have protected him were too busy protecting their own comfort. Real love is not passive. Real love is a detective. It asks the hard questions. It digs through the trash. It risks its own safety to find the blockage and pull it out. It reminds us that we must be vigilant for the vulnerable people in our lives, because sometimes the monsters are not under the bed. Sometimes they are standing right next to us, smiling and holding a bottle of warm milk. If this story touched your heart, or if you have ever been the person who was misunderstood while everyone else looked away, then I want to hear from you. We all have a voice that deserves to be heard. Please like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder to listen a little closer today. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that uncovers the truth. Together we can make sure that no one has to live in silence.